Est-ce que vous pouvez reprendre vos places? On va recommencer. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Is Shawnee around? Shawnee, est-ce que tu es là? Est-ce que tu m'entends dans l'univers? Oui? OK. Au nom de tout le monde dans la salle, je veux te dire merci pour la crème glacée. Everybody seemed really happy. Donc, je m'excuse. Pour notre panéliste ou notre présentateur final, pour ceux qui n'étaient pas dans sa session hier, vous allez être contents. Je fais partie de ces gens-là. Je n'ai pas encore pu l'entendre. Fait que ça donne comme un beau petit boost à la fin de l'après-midi. Monsieur Yuri Van Dan Steve Rosen est le directeur de Mars Solution Lab. Il est depuis longtemps un innovateur social passionné par la transition de notre société vers la société du savoir. Philosophe systémique, il aime travailler avec d'autres pour trouver des solutions innovantes à des problèmes ardus. Il est cofondateur de Kennis Land, un des plus importants laboratoires de changement aux Pays-Bas et en Europe. Il est également cofondateur de Kalfka Brigade, une équipe de recherche qui aide les gouvernements à trouver des solutions, j'imagine, et à lutter contre les méfaits de la bureaucratie. De façon régulière, il donne des conseils, des conférences et des cours sur la façon de créer des changements systémiques. Il a également travaillé avec des organisations comme la Young Foundation et siège au conseil du Lisbon Council, le principal groupe de réflexion sur l'innovation et la croissance en Europe. Yuri will talk to us today on a wonderfully appropriate topic to end our conference, Government in the Making, a reflection on the state of public innovation in an open government. Please welcome Yuri.
Good afternoon. Final speaker of a very long and inspiring conference. But I hope that I can inspire you a little bit more before we depart. But before I wanted to do that, in our work in the lab, we always combine action and reflection. And we've been really active, discussing and listening. So I want to invite you to close your eyes for a moment and to reflect on what you've heard the past 2 days. We started yesterday morning with Kit, formerly from Mind Lab, talking about change. We had many workshops on open government, on transparency, on collaboration, on participation. This morning we had Alan Cantrow, we had the mayor's panel. So you probably have heard a lot. So what is the lesson that stands out for you that you're going to take home? Think about that for a minute. And maybe grab a piece of paper and write it up for yourself so that you don't forget. Okay. So what I wanted to do is to sort of try to close this conference with a bit of a reflection. And that starts by actually looking at GovMaker itself and the role of governments. And I like this quote from Jeff Mulgan: "Governments can be brutal and stupid." And I think everyone here in the room knows that from their own hard experience. But we also know that the best governments have achieved to help their citizens live safe and free and rich lives. And that's the business that we're in here. We're trying to make government good. I think everybody in this room, I definitely believe in good government, in the good of government. But we need to make it better. And we need to, where possible, prevent that government is brutal or stupid. And we need to promote that it is a force of good. And that's really hard, especially if you're inside the system. Like George. Changing the system from the inside, and especially from inside government, is hard. And that was one of the ideas to start GovMaker. Now, 4 years ago. Which was, let's start sort of a movement of people either working in government or working with government to build a smarter government together. That was the idea. It popped up during a discussion that we had in Mars Solutions Lab in I think around the summer of 2013 when we just started. We were only a couple of months old, and we thought, like, well, one of the things that we can do is let's throw sort of a conference and invite people interested in this topic and invite a couple of speakers and have a day, just like the past 2 days. And that was sort of the start of it. And over the couple of years, we ran, from our Solutions Lab, we ran a series on online together with Cisco, GovMaker Telepresence series, where we had every 2 months civil servants from across Canada talking to each other about how do you do that innovation in government. But meanwhile, after that first day in November, Nick Scott here, without whom nobody here in this room would be here today without Nick. Please. Thank you. And no movement can be built without people like Nick that take an idea and run with it. And that's what he did. And that's why we are now here. And I'm very glad to be here again and see how that small idea in the summer of 2013 has now come to a room full of dedicated people that are wanting to make government smarter together. And in that movement, we wanted to the idea behind it was that we wanted to combine two things. We wanted to combine government, which at the official Oxford Dictionary definition of government is it's a system by which a state or community is controlled, which is kind of worrisome that is the official definition from the Oxford Dictionary, by the way. But we wanted to combine that with sort of the maker culture, that hacker, do-it-yourself culture, tinkering with technology, with new devices, and having a culture which is a lot about peer-to-peer, but also about fun and self-fulfillment. And I think the last 2 days have been an excellent example of that sort of culture. And I think we need more of that kind of a culture in government. And in a way, this is our theory of change for that we use in Solutions Lab. GovMaker for us was also part of our strategy to create systems change towards a smarter government. And in our model, and it's based on basically the traditional lab model that Alan Cantrow this morning spoke about as well. If you look at corporate R&D labs or science labs in universities, they always are structuring innovation through a process that starts with a hypothesis, then you try to understand the problem, do your research. That research leads to new insights, new ideas, but those ideas need to be tested. Maybe first in a very managed lab environment, in a small setting, but maybe later, if you have a bit more confidence that that idea will work and some evidence, you'll go out into the field and test it there. And then if you really have evidence that that experiment actually works, you bring that solution to the market. That is the discipline that Alan Cantrow this morning also spoke about. And we have tried to translate that into, well, what if we're not trying to find solutions for a new product or a service, but we're actually trying to create systems change and try to solve complex social or economic problems of society. And in our view, if you want to do that, you need to think about 3 layers. You need to develop solutions and then follow that lab process of understanding the problem, bringing people together, co-creating new solutions, prototype them, and bring them to scale. But in order to do that successfully, and especially to bring a good idea to scale, you also need policy. You need a support system of the policies that sort of support the scaling of any solutions. And maybe funding needs to be changed, regulation needs to be adapted in order to accommodate and create the right context for that innovation to actually scale and flourish. And for that to happen, you don't only need to understand the problem, but you often also need to frame the problem and create a sense of urgency for change. Because especially if the politicians don't see that, or if the public don't see that, there will not be any support for the changes that you want to make. You probably need to create a vision and build a coalition of the willing, so to say, that together want to work on creating a better future. You need evidence from those prototypes that your solutions actually work, because else why would I change that policy? But the third layer, and that is sort of where GovMaker comes into place. Like if you want to make government smarter, we can create new solutions. We can create even policies, open data policies. But if the capacity of the people working in government do not know how to apply, for instance, open data, then probably it will be very difficult to really get change. And that is, in a way, GovMaker is one tiny intervention to help build the capacity in the system. And that often starts with some stakeholders and then the innovators, which is that the innovators are, according to Everett Rogers, the 2 to 5% of the people in an organization that love innovation. You can wake them up in the middle of the night and say, oh yes, I want to do something new, which are great people, but of course we're not going to change government with 2 or 5% of the people. So how do we reach out and build a movement that grows towards the early adapters and then to the early majority of the people? The early majority of the people in organizations say, well, if you want me to change, just like what Alan Cantro said this morning, you need to give me some support, a training, a manual, a toolkit. I want to see some evidence that your solution actually helps me, because else I won't apply it. So how do we build that movement? How do we build that capacity? And for us, when we thought of GovMaker in the summer of 2013, that was part of that, like our strategy for systems change in government and building the capacity of people to actually apply open data and open government concepts. And why again, are we doing that? Well, traditionally, the core argument was because we need to restore trust in government. And around the world, and especially in the US, where a lot of this started, that was a very important argument. But also, if you look at Canada, if you look at the stats, actually, trust in government, last year was an important year, because last year was the first year in decades that trust in government went below 50% in Canada. And it's been on a downward slope the last couple of years. Maybe it's going up now, because this was, of course, the data was before the last election, so who knows what effect that might have been. But that was, why are we doing open government? Because we want to restore trust or build trust of citizens in their government. And sort of the three sort of core principles of open government, and they've been discussed, I think, extensively today as well, are transparency, participation, and collaboration. Transparency is about accountability and providing the public with all the information. Participation, allowing the public to participate throughout the decision-making process. And collaboration is actually about increasing the effectiveness of government. And the Obama administration, since 2009, and Beth Novak, Ann Calantro's colleague, was absolutely instrumental in that. And she was an earlier speaker here at an earlier GovMaker edition. This was really one of the driving forces, because the Obama administration wanted, and that was part of his ticket, to restore trust in government. And now this happens. So I would say the job is not done yet. Because if restoring trust in government was the core argument for open government, I think the election of Donald Trump, we can say, well, there's still a lot of distrust in government. So what does that say about Canada? how can we make sure that basically this doesn't happen to him? Because in a sense, we're now embarking in Canada on an open government strategy, and we're still very much in the beginning of it, in my perspective, and we're making great strides. But we don't want to end up where the US ended up, where we've done all this work on open government, but we still have huge distrust in society. And one of my hypotheses here is that both in the US, and I've seen this globally, that the focus of the discussion of open government has mostly been about transparency and participation. And like all three are important, absolutely. But the key question here for me is, are we trying to do what is most feasible, or are we trying to do what has most impact? And my hypothesis is that we should look more at collaboration. If we really want to restore trust in government, of course, people will want to see where their tax dollars are going. They want to be heard. But fundamentally, they want their government to be effective and to deliver the services that they need, to deliver the policies that they want. And that, in the present day, requires not just transparency and participation, but above all, collaboration. So I think that the discussion in Canada, I would urge, should go more about collaboration, next to transparency and participation. And that is not just because of trust, it's also because the environment of government is changing fundamentally. All our public system, our education system, our health system, our energy system, our democracy, are in need of change because our world is changing. Because of the rise of new technology, the increased demands of citizens, even intense fiscal pressures, and the increased complexity of the world that we live in today. We need to rethink our systems that we have created. And that's not just here in Canada, that is true for governments around the world. So we need to look at that point as collaboration. And that will be harder because it also changes the relation between government and its citizens. Like if it's about transparency, we look at the citizen still as a voter. If we look at participation, it's basically government treating the citizen more as a customer and saying, well, these are the services, but can you tell us what you want that we do? But if we're talking about collaboration, the citizen is becoming a co-producer. So we're changing here, and that it will be hard. But in terms of potential to increase the effectiveness of policy, that is where the most potential is. Because the potential for more effectiveness of policy is not in transparency and participation. I mean, of course, there's some, but not much. And if we want to have a financial lens on it, I think then that's also where we can create more value for less or for the same. And that is where I think this whole notion of innovation labs, public labs, social innovation labs can help on that collaboration front. And the way they help is in 3 ways. And I want to explain each one of them. First of all, and this is aligned with also how the process of innovation works. Innovation always starts with understanding, but what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And really deeply trying to understand that. Because we can organize brainstorms in nice places with, lots of beanbags and lots of Post-it notes. But at the end of the day, it starts with what is the problem that we're trying to solve. We can have a very good problem analysis, but if we don't have a space to experiment, to then act and say, let's try to create new solutions to solve that problem, then we probably will not have much innovation. So that's the second crucial step that innovation always goes, and where innovation labs can help. And thirdly, we can experiment, run a couple of pilots, but if those pilots do not scale, if that doesn't lead to new ways of working by the entire organization, if there's no connection between that single pilot or prototype and how the entire organization or an agency or a policy is changed, there's no scale, then there will not be successful innovation. So innovation is the discipline to go through those three stages. So let's look at the first and how labs can help. If we look at how to understand the problem, most problems are being defined, especially in the government context, from an institutional perspective. I'll give an example of that in a moment. But we think, and that's where labs often help, is that we need two other perspectives next to that institutional perspective, which is absolutely valid, but it's just not enough to really understand especially complex policy problems. We need a user perspective, often using design thinking, and we need a systems perspective. But let's start with that institutional perspective. Back in the Netherlands, I founded an organization called the Kafka Brigade. It's a research team that helps governments, first in the Netherlands, but now actually around the world, to find and fight red tape. And we often found that red tape is sort of unnecessary bureaucracy. I mean, I'm a believer in bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a good thing. I would not want to live in a country without bureaucracy. But the problems of bureaucracy sometimes is that it leads to red tape when everybody is behaving from only an institutional perspective. So we had, for instance, a small business entrepreneur that tried to open up a new business in the city of Amsterdam, and that entrepreneur had to have 17 permits from 17 different government agencies, like the fire department, economic department, food inspection, health inspection, and so on and so on, the tax office. And each of them had a perfectly rational argument for the license and how their processes were organized. It made absolute sense. But collectively, it was insane, because it took 18 months for that small business entrepreneur to go through the entire process. And we literally had people going bankrupt during the application process, because they could only enter the process when they actually were paying rent for their shop. So we started and showing that to those agencies. And we literally invited them into the room with that small business entrepreneur. And we told them that case, sort of a way of design thinking, and to show that that institutional perspective can sometimes actually destroy public value. And that was the start of a sort of redesign of that process. And after a year, we brought it down from 17 permits to 3, and the lead time from 18 months to 13 weeks. And that was hard work, and that was hard discussions sometimes, absolutely, and compromises, and tough negotiations. But that is what this work is about. The same we did, and that's where design thinking really comes into play, when we helped to redesign regulation for the sharing economy. And that's, of course, it's a hotly contested debate. We had the taxi industry and Uber almost literally fighting. And when we had discussions with them in the room, shouting, absolutely. But one of the reasons why we could have a more productive conversation between all the stakeholders, which was also 3 layers of government, because we had the city responsible for licensing, we had the province responsible for insurance, we had the federal government responsible for taxation. We brought them all together and we showed them from a user perspective how that regulation looked like and what the user experience was. And that was the start of a discussion around, so is this the user experience that we want? Is this delivering the public value that we want or not? And if not, where in that sort of regulatory journey do we need to make changes? And that was the start of a sort of a change process. Providing that sort of new perspective is what design thinking can do from sort of the individual citizen. But next to that, you also need the systems perspective. And the words of Ron Heifetz, who writes a lot about adaptive leadership. And if there's one other book next to Peter Drucker that, Alan, I would recommend, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership by Ron Heifetz. Absolutely a great book. And he talks there about the myth of the broken system. It's very easy to always say, yeah, the system is broken. If we talk about childhood obesity or youth employment or poverty or any other climate change. The system is broken. And he says, no, a system is never broken. A system is always perfectly designed to produce the result it currently gets. And if you're not satisfied with those results, you have to basically start to analyze why the system and why agencies in that system are behaving the way they're doing. What are the incentives? And how can we change those incentives? And system thinking can basically start to give you an understanding of that. And especially in a complex problem, that is a perspective that you need. And this is an attempt to, not from us, but from somebody else, to look at obesity from a systems perspective. And what are all the factors that are involved? But only if you have that sort of overview, you can start to make intentional choices. Where do I intervene? If you don't have that, and you're just starting somewhere, take the example of obesity, you just think, oh yeah, let's do something about exercise. Well, why not food? Or why not smoking? Is the choice that you make for the solution that you're developing, is that intentional? Is it intentionally directed at a part of the problem that you think needs to be addressed? Or is it just because you came up with a nice idea in a brainstorm? That's basically what systems thinking helps you to think through. And it also helps you to really dig down in sort of the iceberg that Donald Talamellos talks about, where we not only look at the events, but really dig down to what are the patterns, the underlying structures, and even sometimes the mental models that make that people or organizations behave the way they do. And if we don't get that understanding, we will not get at really true change. So where innovation labs here can help in understanding the problem is about gaining new perspectives, which often is the start of innovation, is actually looking at the problem in a new way, in making your actions intentional, and by spending more time at that starting point, just like what Alan said as well, in defining the problem and understanding the problem, hopefully preventing failures more downstream in implementation. So let's move on. The second phase, space for experimentation. So you can have the best idea in the world, and I totally believe you, but you can never guess. We have to experiment. And especially when solving a complex problem, you can only find out if something works by actually testing it out in practice. We cannot find the truth from behind the draw table. So we have to go out. And like Jan Rotman says, with complex problem, you only actually understand that complex problem once you start to solve it, once you start to get into action. And that's why experimentation is so important, because experimentation is basically the process of acting and reflecting and iterating in that process constantly. And that is what we need to do. And every intervention that we develop is not just a deliberate step to act, but also a deliberate step to learn. And that's where labs help. And that's sort of often referred to as the process of prototyping, which basically is testing your assumptions on everything that you do by asking 4 questions. And the first is my solution desirable? Does it actually solve the problem? Does it fulfill a need or not? Is it desirable what I do? Secondly, is it feasible? Can we actually do it? Because it could be a great idea, but if we can't implement it, then it's not really worth trying. Will it be viable? And with viable, we mean, can it actually survive on its own? Like we can create sort of a lab-safe environment or a pilot with extra support. But of course, we want to actually pressure test if it could also survive without that safe environment out on its own. We need to look at that. Is there a business model in that? And fourth, do we think, and can we see evidence that although we're now still maybe testing things out on a small scale, but what is the evidence that we see that this could deliver impact at scale? Is it actually scalable? Because sometimes we design a pilot, and the pilot works, but it's totally not scalable. You want to test that out. And in a way, the prototyping is an iterative process that constantly asks those 4 questions and starts maybe with very low fidelity prototyping in a table, a storyboarding, or building a solution with paper or with Lego. But that is done not just to be creative and fun, which it definitely can be, but it's about, that's already the first test if your idea is desirable, feasible, viable, and if it will deliver impact. If not, kill it, move on to the next, or redesign it. And it's way easier to redesign it if you still have a model of Lego or paper or drawing it than if it's a pilot in the field, which probably in a later stage you will have to do as well. That's just a later stage prototyping. To give an example of that, we're now working with 16 hospitals and 55 vendors to look at procurement. And the problem with public procurement is that it often actually kills innovation. And why does it kill innovation? Because public procurement is often organized that it really looks at the specs. So the idea is we define the specs of what we're trying to purchase as precise as possible, and then we have the vendors compete on price. But if there's now a vendor that comes in and says, well, actually, I have a solution that provides exactly the value that you want, and maybe even for a cheaper price, but I don't comply with the specs, then you're out. Which is a shame, but that's what the nature of innovation is. So we're now with these hospitals applying a design approach to prototype new ways of procuring, which are focusing not on the specs, but on very sharply defining the value. What is the value of the service, the product, the technology that the hospital is looking for? And can we get that really sharp? And can we then be in a sort of a co-design process with a vendor or with a group of vendors that can then take that and develop a service or a product or a technology around that? Sort of flipping it out. But it's a prototyping process. So, and how innovation labs here can help is, first of all, labs are often sort of the safe space, the neutral but committed convener, because we need many agencies inside government, sometimes even outside government, work together. Then you need sort of a neutral convener that brings everybody together and keeps the eye on the ball. Why are we here? What is the public value at stake? A lab brings a process to actually manage the risks through prototyping. And it creates a learning agenda, because it is about acting and about reflecting, always. So you should never do an experiment without actually having thought through, and how are we going to learn from our experiment? And you need to think about that question before you start experimenting. Last stage is then scaling the solutions that work, and how to do that. And we need to do that because if the solutions that we develop do not match the level of the problem, then we will not have solved the problem. We are regularly also working with philanthropic institutions. And they sometimes have very laudable and great mission statements, saving poverty in Africa. And then they fund someone who's starting an orphanage in Kenya, which is great, but it's not solving poverty in Africa yet. So what is our scaling strategy? And what are our methods to get there? So to give an example of that kind of thinking, this is a project that we're doing with the McConnell Foundation, based in Montreal, who approached us and started to work with us on mental health. And if we look at the situation of our youth, then I think we can safely say that there is a lot to be desired for in terms of their mental well-being. Now, how can we improve that? And we designed an innovation lab around that question. And that started with actually designing the lab and doing research, creating better understanding, what is the problem, talking to youth, studying academic literature. And from that process, we narrow it down to what we can do is focus on the school and the school environment. And how can we make a school environment that is more conducive to mental well-being? And the problem in schools currently is that there is absolutely attention for mental well-being, but that is mostly driven by either government-funded programs or NGOs that come into the school and do a mental health program. And those programs are really good, absolutely, but the problem with them is they come in the second week of October for 5 days, but when they leave, the situation goes back to normal. So actually the impact of those programs is not really sustaining. So how can we create something that is more sustainable? That was sort of the core question that we started. We built a team around that. And then we said, well, let's start in British Columbia. And we invited all the school districts there. There are 60 school districts in British Columbia. Who wants to work with us? We don't have solutions, but this is the problem. We want to work on promoting mental well-being in school communities and by integrating that better into the school community. 6 school districts were selected. 42, by the way, replied. And with them, we started a co-design process, which involved over 400 people, where we started to, with teachers, parents, students, and we're talking K-12 here, all part of the school principals, part of the process, to start to develop ideas. What can schools and the school communities do themselves to promote mental well-being? And also making an analysis, what is in our context relevant? Like we have schools in the inner city of Vancouver. We also have Aboriginal schools up north, part of the program. They develop different kinds of interventions that fit their context. And we then, from that process, we had many hundreds of ideas, but we broke it down, and with those communities decided on 9 interventions and to test and to prototype them. And we developed upfront an evaluation framework that would allow those teachers and school communities to evaluate those interventions themselves. And we built sort of a learning platform for those 6 schools districts to learn amongst themselves. So it was still very closed only there. So that was year 1. But in the design, we already thought, like, how do we get to scale? So now in year 2, we scaled the prototypes that work. We're actually scaling 7 of the 9 that have proven to be effective, and we're scaling them to other school districts in British Columbia. We're also doing a new round where we say, well, those 7 interventions are not enough, so we're doing with different schools. Second round may lead to new interventions, growing the number of interventions available. And we are now talking with Ontario as a second province where we also want to start this process. And in BC, we're in conversations with the government to start to discuss what does this mean for policy, and how could we actually build new regulations or policies that actually would support the further growth of this. And we're building a learning platform which is now more open and which allows schools that are part of the program to share their learnings more widely. And then in year 3 to 5, the idea is to, again, add more provinces, probably another 2 to 3, and scale the prototypes that work and develop more prototypes. And the end goal for year 5 or year 6 is that we hopefully would have 100 or 200 or 300 prototypes that have been tested in school environments, open and shared on a platform where a teacher in Manitoba could say, hey, what they've done in that school in BC, I want to do that in my school as well. I can test it, and I can actually give the test results back to the platform. And build a learning network of teachers and sort of a movement of teachers and people in school communities across Canada that are learning from each other how to build a better climate for mental well-being in schools over a couple of years. And start slowly also with the conversation in government, what that means for policy. And that's sort of our theory of change and our theory of scale. If it will work out, I don't know. We're still end of year 1, so to say, moving into year 2. But that's sort of our thinking of how to get from very small scale in the beginning to large scale change in 5 or 6 years. So where labs here can help is to make sure that you start small and start sort of on a manageable level, But think about scale from day one. How could this go to scale? If it can't go to scale, or if you can't figure that out, why would you do it at all? It's a waste of time. Where you look at the context, and that you allow something that actually takes that context into account. Like some of those solutions will work in certain types of schools, for instance, others in other contexts. And to build a support system for the innovators to take those innovations and apply them in their own context. So that's sort of how labs can help and where I think open government is. And sort of a final message, and I think it's the end of a long conference, but we really have momentum here. I think with the whole open government movement in Canada, we have a new federal government that is far more susceptible for open government and for open data. So we have the momentum, let's not lose it. I think that is now our main challenge. And that part of that means we have to get to that third principle of collaboration. Of course, that doesn't mean that we have to abandon work on transparency and participation. Absolutely not. But I think that we also need to make sure that we work on that collaboration. And with that greater opportunity also comes greater responsibility, which means that we really have to look at innovation as Alan also said this morning, as a discipline. And we have to be good at it, which means that we have to build our capacity and that we have to learn. And that's, I think, where GovMaker is so important. That was it. Long enough. Oh, thank you.
I don't know what it is, but I have something.
Yeah, and if people have questions still, I know it's a long day, so it's probably not, but...
And Nick is checking his watch.
Right.
It's a smart watch. I'm getting that.
He wants to go to a bar, probably, like everybody else.
Questions? Je serai pas méchante, là, vous pouvez poser des questions. Non?
No. Good.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
C'était inspirant. Merci.
Yes.
On est presque à la fin. J'imagine que pour vous, comme pour moi, ça a été des moments très inspirants. J'ai tellement appris de choses dans les derniers 2 jours que j'étais un petit peu comme bête. Je pense que mon cerveau est en train de fondre, mais ça va y aller.